There's a saying common among the elder tribesmen who inhabit the highest, most desolate reaches of the Hindu Kush Mountains. They say that when Alexander the Great marched his massive armies through these valleys over 2,000 years ago, he did not just fight against men. They say he fought against the land itself, and the land fought back. For 20 years, the United States military operated in some of the most remote, hostile, and scientifically defying terrain on the face of the earth. We know the names of the places where the fighting was hardest: the Kurayondal, the Pek, the Waigal. These are places where the map is often just a suggestion and the reality on the ground is vertical rock, dangerously thin air, and a silence so ancient it feels heavy in your lungs. We focus so much on the kinetic war, the firefights, the improvised explosive devices, the complex political dynamics, that we often forget the environment where these events took place. These mountains are old. They are older than history. And when you drop modern soldiers, young men and women equipped with the most advanced surveillance technology in human history, into a place that time forgot, you start to see things that do not fit the manual. You start to see things that cannot be explained in an after-action report. Tonight, we are not talking about combat strategy. We are not talking about the Taliban or insurgent networks. We are talking about the other encounters. The reports that get filed away, laughed off, or whispered about in the chow halls back at Bagram Airfield, only when the lights are low. These are the stories of soldiers who looked through their thermal optics and saw something that was not human, tracking them from the ridge lines. This is the story of what lives in the blind spots of the war in Afghanistan. To understand these accounts, you first have to understand the isolation. In late 2009, a platoon from the 10th Mountain Division was deployed to a small combat outpost of Kop in the Nuristan province. We will not use the real names of the soldiers involved to protect their privacy and their careers, but the location itself is well documented. It was a small patrol base, essentially a series of HESCO barriers and sandbags dug precariously into the side of a mountain, overlooking a valley that served as a major transit route for insurgents coming over the porous border from Pakistan. The elevation was nearly 8,000 feet. The air was so thin that walking in full kit felt like breathing through a straw. The days were scorching hot, the sun magnified by the altitude, and the nights were freezing cold. But the defining feature of this outpost wasn't the weather. It was the feeling of being watched. Sergeant Miller, a squad leader at the time, recalls the first time he sensed it. It was not during a patrol. It was not during a firefight. It was during a quiet night on guard duty, the kind of shift that usually tests your ability to stay awake rather than your courage. The outpost was equipped with LRAS-3 units, long-range advanced scout surveillance systems. These are high-powered thermal optics that can detect a heat signature from kilometers away. They are incredibly sensitive. You can see a rabbit moving on a hillside 3 clicks out. You can see the heat rising from a cooling engine block of a truck that has been parked for hours. Miller was scanning the ridgeline to the north. It was a jagged cliff face, almost vertical, known to the soldiers as the Razor. It was impossible terrain. There were no goat paths. There were no caves that appeared on their maps. It was just sheer, unforgiving rock. Around 0200 hours, under a moonless sky, Miller picked up a heat signature. At first, he assumed it was a goat. The mountains were full of them, and markhor goats are known to climb impossible slopes. But as he watched, he realized the signature was too hot, and it was far too large. In thermal optics, heat translates to light. A human glows white or red depending on your polarity settings. This thing was glowing bright white, indicating a significant amount of body heat. He adjusted the focus, dialing in the lens to get a clearer picture. The figure was standing on a ledge that was maybe 2 feet wide, overlooking the 1,000-foot drop. It was bipedal. It was standing on 2 legs, but the proportions were wrong. Miller described it later as being top-heavy. It had broad, massive shoulders, but it stood with a pronounced slouch that put its arms almost down to its knees. His first instinct was tactical. He assumed it was a fighter, maybe a highly skilled scout for the enemy, looking for a way to flank the outpost and drop mortars on them. He immediately keyed his radio to the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center. He kept his voice calm, professional. TOC, this is Post 1. I have a visual on a PAX, grid reference 1904. He is high up on the Razor. Over. The radio telephone operator and the TOC acknowledged and checked the feeds. They happened to have a drone in the area, a Scan Eagle, and they diverted it to Miller's coordinates to get a better look. Here is where the report gets strange. Miller watched through his ground optics as the drone arrived overhead. The drone has a different angle, looking down from the sky. Miller is looking up from the ground. The figure on the ledge did not react like a human. A human, even a disciplined fighter, usually flinches when a drone buzzes them. The sound is distinctive, like a lawnmower in the sky. Or they freeze, pulling their limbs in tight to blend into the rock. This thing turned. It looked up at the drone. Then, slowly, deliberately, it looked down at Miller. Miller swears that even from 2 kilometers away, through the digital grain of the thermal sight, he felt eye contact. He felt seen. Then, the figure moved. It did not climb down. It did not repel. It leaped. It jumped from the ledge, clearing a vertical gap of about 20 feet to a higher outcropping. It grabbed the rock with one hand and hauled its massive bulk up with a speed that defied physics. A man carrying gear cannot move like that. A man without gear cannot move like that at 8,000 feet. It was fluid, explosive power. Miller tracked it for another 10 seconds before it vanished into a fissure in the rock face that was too small for a human to enter. When the patrol went out the next day to investigate the area, they found the ledge. It was exactly as Miller had seen it, but there were no boot prints. There were no sandal marks. In the thick dust on the ledge, they found a partial impression. It looked like a handprint, but the fingers were too long, and the palm was too wide, and there was a smell. The soldiers described it as a mix of sulfur and rotting meat, a musk so strong it made them gag even in the open air. They did not report the smell, they did not report the print. They reported negative contact and returned to base. Because in a war zone, you report threats you can shoot. You do not report monsters. The incident on the Razor was not unique. As the war dragged on, and American forces pushed deeper into the remote valleys of the Kunar and Nuristan provinces, the stories began to accumulate. Most of them were dismissed as sleep deprivation, altitude sickness, or the result of high-stress environments. And to be fair, many of them probably were. The human brain is an interpretative machine. It looks for patterns in the noise. When you stare at green static for 6 hours a night, eventually, your brain will draw a face in the rocks. But there is a consistency to these accounts that is difficult to ignore. The descriptions are too similar. The behavior is too consistent. In 2012, a Special Forces team was operating in the Kandahar province near a series of limestone caves that had been used by the Mujahideen against the Soviets in the 1980s. Their mission was high-value target interdiction. They were hunting a mid-level commander who was using the caves to store weapons and coordinate attacks. The team inserted by helicopter under the cover of darkness. They moved to the objective on foot, utilizing night vision goggles. The silence in these valleys is absolute. There is no light pollution. The stars look like they are right on top of you, heavy and bright. As they approached the cave entrance, the point man signaled for a halt. He heard something. It was not movement, it was not footsteps. It was a sound. A low-frequency hum, almost like a vibration, that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. The team leader, a seasoned operator with 6 combat tours under his belt, moved up to the front. He heard it too. He described it later as the sound of a large electrical generator running deep underground. But the intelligence briefing was clear: there was no power in this valley, no grid, no generators, just rock and dust. They proceeded with extreme caution. As they entered the cave mouth, the temperature dropped. This is normal for caves, but this was extreme. It went from a cool desert night to freezing in the span of 10 meters. Inside the cave, they found a weapons cache. AK-47s, RPGs, crates of old Soviet munitions, standard insurgency supplies. They began to rig the cache for demolition. That is when the point man, who was pulling security deeper in the tunnel, saw the markings. On the walls of the cave, carved deeply into the stone, were symbols. They were not Arabic. They were not Pashto. They were geometric patterns, complex spirals, and sharp angles that looked ancient, and they were fresh. The stone dust was still on the floor beneath them. Someone, or something, had carved them recently. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It felt oppressive. The team leader gave the signal to blow the charges and exfiltrate immediately. They did not like the feel of the place. It triggered every primal instinct they had, the hair standing up on the back of their necks. As they were moving back to the extraction point, the rear security element reported movement. Visual. 6 o'clock. Something is tracking us. The team leader checked his Blue Force tracker. All friendly forces were accounted for. Is it locals? He asked. Negative. The rear guard whispered over the comms, his voice tight. It's tall. The team picked up the pace. They were not running, but they were moving with urgent purpose. The terrain was rocky and uneven. The thing behind them was keeping pace, matching their rhythm perfectly. When they stopped to listen, it stopped. When they moved, it moved. They reached the LZ, the landing zone, and the Chinook helicopter came in for the pickup, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust. As the ramp lowered and the team scrambled aboard, the rear guard took one last look through his thermal scope back toward the cave entrance. He saw 3 heat signatures. They were standing outside the cave mouth, watching the helicopter. They were standing perfectly still. They were shoulder to shoulder, and they were easily 7 feet tall. The wash from the rotors did not seem to affect them. The dust did not make them flinch. They just stood there, watching the Americans leave. When the team got back to base, they filed their after-action report. They mentioned the weapons. They mentioned the destruction of the cache. They did not mention the geometric carvings or the 3 figures at the cave. The operator who told this story years later said simply, "We were intruders there. Not just in the country, but in that valley. There are things in those mountains that were there long before the Taliban, and they will be there long after we are gone." To understand what these soldiers might be encountering, we have to look at the history of the region. The locals call the Hindu Kush the killer of Hindus, a reference to the harshness of the slave trade routes of antiquity. But before that, the ancients had other names for it. The Greeks believed these mountains were the edge of the known world, the prison of the Titans. The local folklore is rich with entities that are not human. The Barmanu is the Afghan equivalent of the Yeti or Bigfoot. Stories of the Barmanu go back centuries. Shepherds in the mountains describe a large bipedal creature, covered in hair, that lives in the high caves and steals livestock and sometimes women. During the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, there were rumors of Red Army patrols disappearing in the Wakhan corridor. These men were not killed in ambushes. They were not taken prisoner. They simply vanished. Their equipment was found, their vehicles left idling, but the men were gone. The Soviet commanders attributed it to desertion or mujahideen tactics, but the soldiers whispered about the mountain devils. One translated report from the Soviet archives details an incident near the Salang Pass in 1984. A sentry vanished from his post. When the search team fired flares to illuminate the canyon walls, they saw the missing soldier standing on a rock shelf 100 meters up a vertical cliff face. He was motionless. Standing behind him was a large, shadowed figure. When the flare died, the shelf was dark. When they fired a second flare, the shelf was empty. The soldier was never found. These Soviet accounts mirror the American ones decades later. The same locations, the same impossible movement, the same silence. It suggests that the war is irrelevant to these entities. The uniforms change, the flags change, the weapons evolve, but the watchers in the mountains remain the same. Is it possible that American forces, with their deep penetration into previously untouched wilderness, stumbled into the territory of an apex predator that science hasn't classified? Or is it something else? Consider the account of a drone pilot stationed at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, flying missions over Afghanistan remotely. This pilot, let's call him Lieutenant Graves, was operating a Reaper drone over the Helmand province. It was a routine surveillance mission known as mowing the lawn, which means flying in a set pattern to monitor a specific area for hours on end. His target box was a small village suspected of harboring IED makers. It was 300 hours in Afghanistan. The village was asleep. Graves was scanning the perimeter of the village using the FLIR, forward-looking infrared. The heat signatures were standard: goats, a few stray dogs, the cooling embers of cooking fires. Then he saw a heat signature detach itself from the wall of a compound. This happens. People go out to use the bathroom or smoke. But this signature was cold. In FLIR, living things are hot. They show up white or red. Inanimate objects that have absorbed the sun all day are warm. Cold things, like deep water or heavy stone, show up dark. This figure was moving like a man, but it registered as colder than the surrounding ground. It was a black silhouette walking through a gray world. Graves checked his sensor calibration. Everything else was normal. The dogs were hot, the fires were hot. The figure was cold. He zoomed in. The figure walked through the village. The village dogs, which usually barked at everything, went silent. Graves watched as the figure approached a sleeping dog. The dog didn't wake up. The figure stepped over the dog. It walked to the center of the village, stood there for a moment, and then looked up. We have heard this detail before, the entity looking up at the aircraft. But a Reaper drone orbits at 20,000 feet. You cannot see it with the naked eye. You cannot hear it. Yet the cold figure looked directly at the camera. Graves said the figure then did something impossible. It began to fade, not walk away, not hide. It dissolved. The black silhouette became gray, blending into the temperature of the ground until it was gone. Graves recorded the footage. He flagged it for the intelligence analysts. 2 days later, he asked the intel officer about the clip. The officer told him it was a sensor artifact, a glitch in the thermal processing software. He was told to delete the log entry. Graves knows what a glitch looks like. Glitches pixelate. They freeze. They don't walk through a village, step over a dog, and look at the camera before vanishing. What Graves saw remains unexplained, but it aligns with the local belief in the jinn. In Islamic theology, which dominates the region, the jinn are a separate race of beings created from smokeless fire. They live in a parallel dimension but can interact with ours. They can be seen or unseen. They can be physical or ethereal. And they are known to inhabit desolate places, ruins, deserts, and mountains. American soldiers are briefed on the cultural beliefs of the Afghan people. They are told about tribal dynamics, religious customs, and social taboos. They are not briefed on the entities that the locals believe share the land with them. But when you spend enough time in the dark, watching through the green glow of night vision, the line between folklore and reality starts to blur. There is another story, perhaps the most disturbing of all, that comes from the Keringal Valley. The Keringal is often called the Valley of Death due to the intensity of the fighting there. It is a steep, forested valley where the enemy could be 10 meters away and you wouldn't see them. A platoon was dug in at a small observation post named OP Restrepo. The fighting was constant, the stress was unimaginable. One night, during a rare lull in the fighting, a sentry named Corporal Hayes was manning the M240 machine gun. The moon was full, illuminating the valley floor below. Hayes wasn't using night vision, he was just scanning with his eyes. He saw movement in the tree line about 300 meters out. He tensed up, expecting a Taliban assault. He put his hand on the charging handle of the gun. But the movement wasn't tactical. It was erratic. A figure emerged from the trees. It was wearing what looked like ragged robes. It was walking into the open, directly into the kill zone of the machine gun. Hayes was about to shout a challenge, but he froze. Behind the first figure, another emerged. And another. There were 5 of them. They weren't carrying weapons. They were walking in a single file line, moving slowly, rhythmically. They were swaying. Hayes grabbed his radio handset. TOC, this is Post 2. I have 5 packs in the open, no weapons visible. They're just walking. The sergeant of the guard came running up. He looked through his binoculars. What are they doing? The sergeant whispered. The figures stopped in the middle of the clearing. They formed a circle. And then they started to scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, it wasn't a battle cry, it was a high-pitched, oscillating shriek that sounded like metal grinding on metal. It echoed off the valley walls. The soldiers in the outpost woke up, everyone manned their weapons. They thought it was a psychological warfare tactic. The Taliban were known to taunt soldiers, but the sergeant, looking through the high-powered optics, saw something that made his blood run cold.
They don't have faces,
he said. Hayes looked through the scope. The moonlight hit the figures. Where a face should be, there was just smooth flesh, no eyes, no mouth. Yet the screaming was coming from them. The screaming lasted for 2 minutes, then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The figures turned and walked back into the trees. Gulkin didn't fire. They were authorized to engage anyone posing a threat, but the sheer wrongness of the situation paralyzed them. You are trained to shoot a man with an AK-47. You are not trained to shoot a faceless entity screaming in the moonlight. The next morning, a patrol went down to the clearing. They found the spot where the figures had stood. The grass was dead. Not trampled, dead. It had turned gray and brittle, forming a perfect circle in the green vegetation. They asked their interpreter about it. The interpreter, a local Afghan who had seen combat and was afraid of nothing, refused to go near the circle. He wouldn't even look at it. He told the lieutenant, "This is a bad place. The rocks are angry. We should not be here." The U.S. military withdrew from the Korangal Valley in 2010. We left the outposts. We left the territory. Today, the valley is quiet again. The Taliban claimed victory, but the locals know that the valley never really belonged to the Taliban, and it never belonged to the Americans. These stories force us to confront a question that military debriefings do not ask. What happens when we project modern power into ancient mysteries? We map the world with satellites, we analyze it with algorithms, we convince ourselves that there are no blank spots left on the map. We believe that if it exists, we can see it, categorize it, and kill it. But the soldiers who stood guard on those lonely peaks know differently. They know that there are things that do not show up on the map. They know that when you stare into the dark through a thermal scope, sometimes the dark stares back. The accounts we have shared tonight are just a fraction of the stories that are out there. There are stories of phantom lights in the sky over the Panjshir Valley that move faster than any jet. Stories of voices coming over secure radio channels, speaking languages that no linguist can identify. Stories of caves that go down so deep they seem to breathe. Skeptics will say these are hallucinations, just the firing of tired synapses in the brains of exhausted men. And perhaps that is the most comforting explanation, because if it's just in their heads, then the world is still safe. The world is still rational. But ask the pilot who saw the cold figure vanish. Ask the special forces operator who heard the hum in the earth. Ask the sentry who saw the faceless men. Ask them if it felt like a hallucination. They will tell you that the fear they felt wasn't the fear of combat. It was a primal fear. The fear of prey realizing it is being watched by a predator it cannot understand. War changes people. It alters your perception of reality. But maybe, just maybe, it also peels back the layer of noise that usually distracts us and allows us to see what has been there all along. The war in Afghanistan is over. The troops are home. The outposts are abandoned, reclaimed by the wind and the sand, but the mountains remain. And whatever walks those high ridges in the moonlight is still there. These accounts are difficult to verify. By their very nature, they exist in the fog of war, in the gray area between fact and perception. But they are shared by men and women who are trained observers, professionals who are not given to flights of fancy. We treat these stories with respect because they are part of the soldier's experience. They are part of the burden they carry home. I want to turn this over to you. If you are a veteran, or if you know someone who served in these regions, have you heard similar stories? Did you experience something in the high peaks or the deep valleys that you couldn't explain? The comments section below is open. We want to hear your accounts. We believe that documenting these unexplained events is just as important as documenting the history of the conflict itself. If you found this investigation compelling, please leave a like on the video. It helps us get these stories out to more people. And if you want to join us as we explore the mysteries that lie in the shadows of history and conflict, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on.